So I've been asked to speak to the issue of the economy, the Zimbabwean economy, and priorities for socio-economic transformation. There's so much to say about the economy, to the extent that we can spend the whole day or the whole week or the whole month just talking about the economy or what remains of it. So I just want to start by looking at a conceptual framework that was developed by Guy Monet, which I think provides us with quite a useful conceptual framework for analyzing the state of the Zimbabwean economy. I think we are all familiar with the work of Guy Monet, the Enclave economy, the dual Enclave economy, where basically he looked at this perennial problem of underutilization of resources, which basically implies underdevelopment, which can be traced to the legacies of our economy, the colonial legacies of Enclave and dual economies, where basically underdevelopment in Africa, according to his assessment, reflects the embedded economic dualism that is associated with the grafted type of capitalism that was carved out during colonialism, where colonialism captured a segment of the economy, which was under the formal sector in terms of the mining sector, manufacturing sector, and all these other formal sectors, leaving the majority of the people in the what we generally refer to as the either communal or informal economy. I think we can see this is sort of like a very, very diagrammatic way of looking at this dual economy, where basically grafted capitalism refers to that small enclave, the formal sector, which at independence employed just 20% of the labor force. So just 1 million people were actually employed in the formal sector. And as you are aware, the formal sector is where all the protection is. The labor administration is actually focusing on the formal sector. You can see there all the development policies are actually, the arrows are actually going towards the formal sector, whether it's financial intermediation, whether it's wage policies, whether it's employment policies, industrial policies, and other sectoral policies, savings, investment policies, they're all just targeting. That's, I think, the distortion of this development framework, where basically the focus was just on the formal sector, which was basically male-dominated, and the rest, the majority, 80% of the labor force, was actually left either in the communal sector or in the informal economy. And if you look at the key characteristic of this enclave, because enclavity basically is a concept that has been used, especially by Guy Monet, to reflect the lack of linkages within the sectors, within the formal and the rest of the economy. The formal sector was basically related with the communal sector in a way that exploited the communal sector in terms of a source of cheap labor. If you fell sick or ill, I mean, we know it also with the migrant labor system in Southern Africa, in the formal sector, you had to recuperate back in the communal sector. So the communal sector also acted as the form of social protection. And the distortion basically is that 80%, the huge majority of our people are actually languishing in the informal and communal sectors, which generally are referred to as the non-formal segment. I think what is critical in terms of development is the very imperative that informs the organization of production within these two sectors. In the formal sector, the means of production, whether it's labor, capital, technologies, etc., are mobilized, are organized to produce a surplus which is plowed back, and the whole process of capital accumulation takes place. In the non-formal segment, basically, there's very little capital and there's a lot of labor. So there's a lot of underemployment, work sharing in the non-formal segment, that is the informal and communal sectors. To the extent that you can remove quite a substantial amount of that labor without actually impacting on the output. I think that's the essence of that. And people are exerting, they are working so hard to achieve very little. There's a lot of exertion and long working hours. There's no regulation at all. You won't see labor officers or trade unions or anyone else, regulating that particular sector. It's a free-for-all sector. You go to Mbaremsika, you find those people waking up around 3 a.m. You find they're already sort of up and about. Late at night, these days in town, even in town, around 11 o'clock, they're still working. So that's the essence, that's the challenge with this particular economy. So in essence, the formal sector was more linked, not necessarily internally. The linkages were more external with the metropole. If you remember Gunda Frank and others, when they wrote about dependence theory, I think they were highlighting that relationship, where basically the formal sector is more integrated with the non-formal, with the external economy, either through imports or exports, that is trade, foreign direct investment. No foreign direct investment will be targeting those other segments, communal sector or informal economy. External credit, technology, expatriate labor, aid, all that will actually be focusing on the formal segment. So the essence is that at independence, the expectation then was that the formal segment will expand laterally to eat into the non-formal segment. In essence, that's the process of development, expanding the realm, the influence of the formal segment. So the expectation was that the formal sector would expand laterally, and basically more and more people will actually be within the ambit of the formal segment. I think that's the essence of that development framework. That's why I just quickly looked at the way Guy Monet looked at it. So part of the problem, challenge with this economic setup that we inherited is that the economy actually suffers from a number of limitations. The first one being no lack of internal demand. So there's no demand within the internal economy, as the majority of the people, as I indicated, are actually in the non-formal segment, isn't it? They constitute very little demand. There's very little. In economics, we actually talk about notional and effective demand. Notional demand is wishful thinking, isn't it? If only wishes were horses. You just say, oh, if I had money, I would buy this or do that. But effective demand is that wish is backed up by buying power. So in essence, the majority of our people do not have, they constitute notional demand. They don't even have that effective purchasing power to actually realize. So that's part of the problem that inhibits the development of that economy. Limited internal savings because of the manner in which activities are organized, where basically it's a survivalist economy, especially in the communal segment of the economy. There is very little or low levels of savings in that segment, which therefore implies that there is little capacity within that economy to generate the savings that can then be intermediated by the financial sector for investment and growth. So that's the challenge with that type of economy. So it also limits itself in terms of even integration. You're integrated in a very weak base, on a weak basis, isn't it? You are simply an economy where, because of the division of labor, you actually focus on production of raw materials. You just get the mineral from the soil and you export it in raw form. So there's very little addition. If you look at the SADC industrialization strategy, it has highlighted that because of the focus of the SADC economies on just production of raw materials, we are only getting 10% of the potential value of the products that we are producing. So in essence, that's the challenge with an economic setup like this economy that we inherited. So in essence, when we sum up this conceptual framework very quickly, if you want to look at whether we are progressing or not as a country, the ILO has come up with a framework where you look at the labor market and you look at the share of the formal segment in total employment. If the share of the formal segment is high or is increasing, that is a better employment outcome. So in essence, when we are looking at the Zimbabwean situation, we want to check whether that formal segment is expanded, whether more and more people are actually employed, have got jobs that are productive, that are remunerative, that are protected, that have got rights. So that's the essence of the first criteria that the ILO is to come up with. The second one basically looks at output per worker in the non-formal segment. In essence, if you remove, as you remove more and more workers out of the informal and communal sector, output per person in that particular segment is expected to increase. The third aspect or criteria that is used is output per worker in the non-formal segment. Okay, I've highlighted that. And then the last one is the unemployment rate. If you've got lower levels of employment, then you've got a better labor market situation. So these are the criteria that the ILO has come up with in order to assess the extent of the labor market. I just captured this because it basically tells us the whole story that I'll be talking about, the structural transformation. If you compare us, is there a pointer here? The middle one. Okay. Where is the pointer? No pointer. Oh, there's no pointer. Okay, that's fine. If you look at this, the first column, basically region 1 is Southeast Asia, and region 6 is Sub-Saharan Africa. Just look at the situation in 1981. Compare East Asia with Sub-Saharan Africa. You'll find that in 1981, 78% of the people in Asia were below the poverty line. In Africa, it was 52%. But look at what happened, isn't it? Fairly quickly, rapidly, East Asia was able to push a lot of its people out of poverty. Do you see that? They said that as of 2011, only 7.9% of the people in Asia are actually below the poverty line. because of the structural transformation that has taken place. In essence, the theoretical framework is such that if you are able to move your means of production, your resources, including especially labor, from the low productivity sectors like agriculture to higher productivity sectors where there's greater potential for remunerative jobs, for productive jobs in industry and also in the service sector, then that actually enables you to reduce poverty quickly enough. So that's what exactly happened in Asia. They were able to reconfigure and re-engineer their economies through industrialization. It's like that more and more of their workers, of their people, moved from actually eking out a living out of agriculture into manufacturing and services. And hence in Africa, because there's very little structural transformation that has taken place. That's why you see even up to now, the number of people that are in poverty has barely moved, isn't it? We just moved from about 56, isn't it? 56% in 1990 or 60% in 93. Now it's around 50%. But if you look at even South Asia, region 5, we used to do better than them up to probably the late 80s, isn't it? That's where basically you see even South Asia has actually overtaken Africa. And then generally you can see the reason basically, if you look at the Africa Economic Outlook report of 2013 by the ADB, actually it highlights this challenge that in Africa, part of the problem is that we still remain steeped in primary commodity production. And our people are still basically, in the majority, actually employed in agriculture. We haven't actually re-engineered our economies such that more and more of our people are moving into industry. Then if you look at the economic blueprints that we have implemented from independence, growth with equity, Ibo, can speak to this, transitional national development plan, all this. You look at the situation from 1990, in the 90s, the focus was more on the social aspects, isn't it? There was very little growth that happened. And then because of the massive thrust that into social expansion, social services, especially education and healthcare, at the end of the decade, it was very, very difficult to sustain that in the context of an economy that was hardly growing. So as a result, you remember the debate in the late 80s, the lack of investment in the economy, etc., the lack of erratic growth in the economy, which could no longer sustain the social sort of agenda that government had implemented. And then that was part of the reason why there was consensus, basically, I recall that vividly, that something had to be done in terms of reforms. But however, the direction of reforms had not been agreed. But unfortunately then, that's when Chizero and others actually pushed us now into the structural adjustment program, which was more market-driven. And the problem with such a program, basically, is that you are now relying on markets. Markets, basically, it's your wallet, isn't it? If you don't have anything in your wallet, we've seen the structure of an economy where the majority of your people are actually excluded from productive economic activities. So as such, given such scenario, then it means that the majority of your people cannot benefit when you rely on market forces. So that's the essence. If you have an economy, such economies, dual and enclave economies like ours, the state has to play a proactive role, an important role in the economy, rather than what we experienced under ESAP rolling back the state. Then after ESAP, when people were angry and said, no more ESAP, even the president pronounced himself on that and said, no more ESAP, then we came up with Zimprest. And then you can see there, after Zimprest was launched in I remember vividly, it was supposed to start in 96 to 2000. It was launched 2 years late in 1998. It was never implemented. And then we came up with thereafter with very short-term programs. Zimbabwe no longer had a medium-term program, which is a challenge now. There's no medium to longer-term vision. You are just, coming up with knee-jerk reactions to crisis. That's actually the onset of the crisis. And we can come now to where we are now under Zim Asset. And whilst we're still in the middle of Zim Asset, there's now a 10-point plan, isn't it? The president just announced that there's a 10-point plan. How they are related, how they are supposed to, the synergies between them is not clear, isn't it? They are actually operating concurrently at the moment, the 10-point plan of last year and Zim Asset. So that's the challenge that we've had in terms of economic programming. The programs have hardly been even implemented. We have actually been reacting to crisis. So there hasn't been a telegraphical sort of focus or approach at dealing with the identified medium-term programs. Right now I'm working with the ILO on Rwanda, It's amazing. You go to Rwanda, they've got Vision 2020. We want to reduce our poverty from 58%, now it's 44%, to 20% by 2020. I want to create 1.8 million jobs, 200,000 jobs a year. They have got targets, and every year they are meeting to discuss those. Yet in February right now in Rwanda, ministers are frightened because everyone comes, everyone called a leader, congregates, and if your ministry is raised as creating problems in terms of achievement of those targets, you are immediately fired. That's how they do it in Rwanda. So they've got, it's quite strategic, it's quite interesting the way they are doing it. And they've been able to move people out of poverty. And in Rwanda, they don't have resources like us. They only have tea, coffee, and gorillas. That's the only, so those are the resources. They don't have much in terms of natural resources in Rwanda. And they don't even have land. It's the most densely populated place, Kigali. I mean, Rwanda generally. There's no land, they have no resource, but just the will. I mean, if you see what it is done to leadership, you are right, Kagoro. It has made a difference. Let me fast track now to the crisis. We are all aware of the crisis since 1997, when government decided to pay war veterans 50,000 and a gratuity of 2,000 Zim dollars per month, which was not budgeted for. And then we ended the war in the DRC at high cost to the economy. We don't have the resources. They hadn't been budgeted in the, included in the budget. We had serious challenges. And there was a fallout with the international finance institutions. For the first time in 1999, Zimbabwe reneged on servicing its debt. And as a result, basically, there were all sorts of problems. The emergence of the MDC, I'm sure you've discussed the politics. I'm focusing more on the economy, but it did have implications on the economy as well. So from 2000, from 1999, when we had negative growth rates, we lost about 51% of our GDP. So in 2009, Zimbabwe moved actually from being the second largest economy in SADC to the current level where we're number 11 in SADC. So, however, the adoption of the multi-currency regime and cash budgeting and the discontinuation of the quasi-fiscal operations by the Reserve Bank. You remember the Reserve Bank had become everything. They become agriculture, they become in charge of local authorities, everything. And they were printing money, basically, to run this, which was highly inflationary. And as a result, basically, everything collapsed in 2008. I think we are familiar with that. So the coming in of the multi-currency stabilized the economy. And as a result, we saw also, because of the liberalization of the pricing mechanisms, we saw a rebound in the economy, with economic growth averaging 10% between the period 2009 and 2012. However, it was not based on any sustained reforms. It was just a rebound, just based on the relaxation of pricing and the stability that had been created, where businesses said, now we can begin to bake bans. Because in 2008, nobody was doing anything, isn't it? Not even a ban was being baked here in Zimbabwe because of, you remember, the price controls, which were setting prices at levels below there. Then, unfortunately, 2013, the rebound basically started weakening, and growth basically declined to 4.5% in 2013, and in 2014, 3.8%, 2015, basically 1.5%, and this year there was a debate where we had a meeting with the World Bank last week, where the Minister of Finance was insisting that his projection this year is that we are going to grow by 2.7% in 2016. And even the World Bank were saying, no, we can't grow by 2 with the El Nino impact, isn't the drought, with the weakening international commodity prices. Where are you going to get that driving force to even do that better than last year? In fact, if anything, if you are a good projector, you can't do anything better than last year, because I mean the context is actually deteriorating. So basically, the minister insisted that he can achieve 2 to 3% growth on the basis that we are now undertaking reforms. But if you understand the political economy of reforms, you don't reap in the same season that you sow, isn't it? Even assuming that you undertake successful reforms, there's a lagged response, isn't it? You won't necessarily benefit in the same year where you're undertaking those reforms. So it's unrealistic that to expect that we'll grow by 2.7% this year. So in essence, we are way, way below even the Zim asset targets of 7.1% growth rate. But I just want to highlight one interesting dynamic which informs the structural changes, ranging structural changes that the economy has experienced over time. If you look at the 1990s up to 2000, you can see there the role of agriculture, isn't it? Accounting for 79%, the blue one, not Dynamos, it's just blue. 79% of our export earnings were coming from agriculture. Look at the mining sector, the level of manufacturing was actually going down. Look at the crisis period now, the new millennium, 2000 to 2008. You can see there a reversal, isn't it? Land reform, fast-track land reform, and the way it decimated agriculture, immediate impact. You can see there agriculture falling by minus 78% in terms of export earnings. What emerges is mining as the major sort of driver. In essence, you can see, therefore, you can conclude that Zimbabwe was almost like firing on one cylinder, isn't it? You know, you are just, and if you understand the mining sector is capital intensive, you are not doing anything in terms of human development. And if you go back to Guy Monet's Enclave and Conceptual framework, that mining sector is just hauling the mineral from the ground and exporting it in raw form, isn't it? So in essence, you are not actually creating internal linkages within your economy, which can benefit the economy. So in essence, that's part of the challenge with the new structure of the economy. If you look at the current situation now, post the GNU or the GNU period from 2009, you can see there the role of agriculture and basically mining. If you add those two, they are contributing 98%, isn't it, of our export earnings, which means that Zimbabwe has become what it wasn't in 1980, a typical sub-Saharan African economy dependent on primary commodities, isn't it? So it means that our fate now depends on the vagaries of the international commodity markets. That's the essence of this ranging structural change. And from the structural issue that we're looking at, Guy Monet's framework, isn't it? You are in a better position, and economic progress entails moving your labor from agriculture into higher value addition manufacturing. But look at what's happening in Zimbabwe. You know, manufacturing is actually collapsing, isn't it? Deindustrialization, I think we've seen it since the 90s. The economy has sustainably, persistently been deindustrializing. And you can see, therefore the blue thing is hardly there, the manufacturing sector. So I've already spoken about this. I won't spend too much time now on this in the interest of time. Look at agriculture productivity. You know, you can look at identify any agricultural commodity. You can see that basically the productivity levels, agricultural productivity, is navigating around zero, isn't it? Around zero, basically 0.8. That's the average yield per hectare in terms of maize. So that's part of the challenge. That, I mean, productivity, there's hardly any productivity to talk about in the economy. So in essence, the basis for that growth is not there. I just use this to illustrate part of the challenge. Now, if you look at what has happened since 1980, blue is Zimbabwe, green is not Cape United, it's the world. The red one is not Lancashire Steel, it's SSA. Just look at the Zimbabwean one, the way it's erratic, isn't it? My generation, we used to play with yo-yos. The Hopewell Gumbos never saw that. The yo-yo, I mean, you know the disconcerting propensity of a yo-yo. It goes up and down, isn't it? That is typical of the Zimbabwean performance, isn't it? Look at 1980, the blue one. It's going up and down, up and down. If you are Ibo Mandaza, a planner, isn't in government, can you do much? You can't project, isn't it? You can't plan the future, isn't it? When you have an economy which it's almost like your child. Today they get 98%, the next day they get 15%, the next day 45%. You're not too sure whether isn't. It's very difficult for you to find a way, isn't, of a hobby. That's the challenge now with the Zimbabwean economy. Where you are just going like this, like a yo-yo, isn't? Even sub-Saharan Africa is relatively stable, isn't? The growth rates. Or if you look at the world one, it's relatively stable. Yes, they are fluctuating, but I mean, the levels are much, but the Zimbabwean one, especially the millennium period, isn't? When everyone else was growing, the period of the super commodity cycle from 2001 to almost 2013, commodity prices, unprecedented rise in prices of international commodities. Zimbabwe failed to take advantage of that, isn't it? We had our own issues. Zimbabwe was in splendid isolation during that period. So you can see there Zimbabwe is moving in the opposite direction of everyone else, isn't it? During that whole period. So that's part of the challenge. Here I'm just reflecting what was happening, the super international commodity prices that drove growth in Africa, you know, beyond the traditional 3%. If you read ECA reports way back in the 90s, I mean, you'd hardly get African economies growing by more than 3%. But after 2000, thanks to the super commodity price cycle, most countries basically were able to sustain rates of growth above 3%, way above 5%. So you can see basically Zimbabwe is a atypical experience. You can look at our stock market. That's how it looks in recent years. I just compared it, contrast with Joburg. It tells you something, isn't it? It's the opposite, isn't it? Ours is moving in the opposite direction. In Joburg, the stock exchange is also moving in the other direction. Deflation, it reflects the lack of buying power, isn't it? There's no buying power. That's what this deflation is talking about, speaking to negative inflation rates, isn't it? Showing you that there's no demand, isn't it? If you want to sell your house, to sell anything in Zimbabwe, it's pretty much difficult because people don't have, the majority of the people don't have purchasing power. So external trade, basically, our trade, if you look at our trade, part of the challenge is that it's not that we are not making money. Part of the problem is that our imports have actually averaged before 2013, 7.5 billion US dollars, paid for in cash. Our exports were just almost a third or so of that. So that's part of the problem in Zimbabwe, where basically we are actually getting more money out, isn't paying out more than what is coming into the country. What is ideal is a scenario where your trade balance, your imports are much higher than your imports. Your exports are much higher than your imports. So that actually, it entails more resources, more liquidity is actually being pumped into your economy. But what's happening is that Zimbabwe is pumping out a lot of its resources out of the country. I think that's the essence of the monetary policy, isn't it? That was just launched last week, where the governor is bemoaning the very fact that Zimbabwe is experiencing huge leakages of resources. The Minister of Finance indicated that annually we are losing 1.8 billion, isn't it, in resources that are going out of the country, which is enough to pay the outstanding arrears to the IFIs. They stand at 1.8 billion, the ones that we have to pay by 31st April this year. So in essence, it's not a problem of resources, it's also a problem of stewardship. The Minister of Finance has raised quite a number of issues. Here, we also discussed this issue, this is from the World Bank. There's hardly any export culture in Zimbabwe if you compare with other countries. Our exports are less diversified than they used to be. You can look at all these other countries. We're not even comparing with Asia. If you compare with Malawi and so forth, those are becoming, their export basket is becoming more diversified. You know, we always say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but Zimbabwe is putting all its eggs now increasingly in one basket. That's what it entails. So in essence, you look at our exports are increasingly resource intensive. It's basically primary commodities that Zimbabwe is in debt distress. We are failing. Can you imagine you're an individual, you owe everyone here money, and you can't even figure out how you can pay, isn't it? And you are now in debt distress, isn't it? Right? You can't even pay your arrears and so forth. And I mean, everyone will whisper to each other, isn't it? That he owes me money, he owes me money, and no one will give you new money. But Zimbabwe has been saying we are under sanctions, isn't it? Right? But it's not sanctions, it's just financial prudence. No one will give you money unless you develop a good track record. So we don't have that track record. We borrow, but we haven't been paying. It has become a big problem, this whole debt issue. I'll come to it later on when I look at this re-engagement, which is basically driven not on development imperatives, not on dealing with poverty or Zimbabwean issues, but it's based on the imperative of just paying back your debts. It's not a developmental discourse, if you want. You look at our dependency in terms of revenue. Revenues are basically coming from us individuals now. Corporates are hardly isn't contributing to taxes now. You can see now it's payee that actually is contributing quite a lot in terms of taxation. So weak institutional governance, this is from the budget, where the Minister of Finance is actually saying we can't move the economy with the institutional, with this culture that we have developed. For example, all these parastatals have collapsed. Zimbabwe Electricity Transmission Development Corporation is given as an example. They are owed 1 billion, and yet they come to the budget, they want 482 million. So you can see our institutions have become a drag because of the culture of cronyism, patronage, etc. They have not performed, and they cannot perform, and yet they should play a critical role. And interestingly, even in the same budget, it's not coming from me, don't quote me, the minister is even saying that they got more out of diamonds, I quote here. This is a resource, diamonds, that seems to have not benefited the generality of our people, notwithstanding that the diamond industry has potential to uplift our population, especially as we fully exploit the diamond value chain. Indeed, there was greater economic impact from diamonds during times of uncontrolled alluvial panning than what is being realized following introduction of formal diamond mining arrangements. This is from the budget, the current latest budget. It's not coming from anyone, from a radical sort of, it's the Minister of Finance who is sitting on the fiscus, who is saying, guys, our resource stewardship leaves a lot to be desired. So right now they are saying that the alluvials are finished, but we can't account for what we did. We can't attract foreign direct investment. This is from CZI. You can see basically the environment, the context is largely inimical. Look at FDIs compared to low developing countries. This is Zimbabwe, FDIs to Zimbabwe is a proportion of FDIs to low-income countries. We're not even comparing with medium, just low-income countries. We've even lost out, isn't it, to low-income countries. So in essence, you also look at our fiscal space, which basically reflects the avenues available to government in terms of funding. Government can source funding from assistance from external sources, from domestic resource mobilization, deficit financing, reprioritization of activities. Of Zimbabwe, again, in terms of funding, that's where the developmental issue is not there, isn't it? We're just relying on the second pillar because we haven't re-engaged the international community. So in essence, what it entails is that whatever we get is off budget. It's not developmental, it's not coordinated by government. So we are relying on taxation. If you look at the tax ratio in Zimbabwe, around 26% of the GDP. In Africa, it's generally below 20%. Zimbabwe is very efficient in terms of collecting taxes. I think we all testify to that. We feel overtaxed. So the issue now is that there is hardly any room for maneuver in terms of taxation. And yet now we can't even reprioritize expenditures, isn't it? If you just look at even the tests now for our leadership, the cars that they are driving now, Range Rovers, the latest Range Rover, and you ask yourself, an economy that is failing to provide water, is it because we don't have resources? It's basically a problem. I was talking to parliamentarians last time when we were analyzing the budget. I said, you are representing the people. You must look at this and question. You are also contributing because you are refusing to buy locally assembled cars, isn't it? You are saying, we don't want locally assembled cars. What does it mean? It means that all your due is watering other lands, your resources. So the problem that we don't have water, we have got potholes and so forth, it's not because local authorities cannot fix them. Look at the developments now. All the good football teams are owned by local authorities, isn't it? Harare City Council, Harare City, they are now getting the best coaches, all the footballers, they are well financed. But that same local authority cannot fix the roads. Mutare has got a newly promoted football team, isn't it? In the Super League. Blawayo, the same thing. And yet they're technically insolvent, isn't it? It's an issue of priority, isn't it? Our priorities are hopelessly misplaced. So it's not that we don't have resources. It's what we are doing with the resources. When you are a student of economics, the first lesson you learn is that resources are finite and your ones are unlimited, isn't it? Then you have to prioritize. So you start with what matters, isn't it? We say water is life. And yet in Zimbabwe, we don't start with life, isn't it? We start with issues that have nothing to do with life. If you ask anyone who was in the civil service in the 80s, they drove Peugeot 305s, isn't it? Yeah. Basic cars assembled here in Zimbabwe. But now, all of a sudden, there's a new culture that defines us. So in essence, these are some of the things that we have to look at. If you look at the budget itself, it's not a developmental budget. We're talking about transformation, isn't it? It requires the state to play a strategic role. But the state has to have resources. But in the context of Zimbabwe, you see a situation now where the 4 billion, it's almost, I was saying to parliamentarians, the budgeting process is almost like a game of hit and miss, played with more enthusiasm than success. Every year we pitch the budget at 4 billion, isn't it? At midterm, we reduce it to the reality is 3.5, isn't it? Because we can't collect the money. And then the next year we pitch it again at 4, and then we reduce it. Every year we do, it's insanity, isn't it? We are not moving. We are actually in the same place. So if you look at the budget as it's an instrument for development, isn't it? It's your annual plan. It's a means of rolling out your medium-term plans. But if you look at the context of Zimbabwe, 80% of that budget is going towards employment costs, isn't it? Salaries. And even on salaries, we are in arrears. We are failing to pay, isn't it? This year, we are struggling to pay last year's salaries, right? And we are being told by fiscals that they won't be able to clear even the bonuses until May, June, isn't it? So what does it mean? May, June, half year through, they say 2016, you're struggling to pay salaries for last year. We're not talking about fixing the roads. We're not talking about ensuring that there's water. We're not talking about energy, all those things, developmental issues. So the budget is highly consumptive. 92% of the budget is recurrent, is for consumption. If you look at the consumption ratio in Zimbabwe, it's more than 100%, which means that we are dis-saving. We are eating everything that we have, and we are even borrowing to eat. That's the dilemma that we face in Zimbabwe. So we can't be developmental, we can't be transformational. We're talking about, I've been asked to talk about transformation. So you can't. Look at this, the minister bemoaned this issue, where part of the problem with the employment costs. He says there was a wage freeze. This is the employment in government, excluding the army. Of course, for obvious reasons, Chinama Saud didn't want to touch the army. In 2011, the government agreed to a freeze on recruitment. And the minister is even wondering aloud, but why is that the employment levels are rising? That's the question that he was asking. He even had an answer when he was trying to come up with a solution. He said, we need to target youth officers at what level, isn't it? He knows where the recruitment was taking place clandestinely. And he identified that in the budget. You look at the scenario now in Zimbabwe in terms of employment costs. We have got this record now in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. We are the country that leads everyone else in terms of channeling our resources towards employment costs, isn't it? So the budget is the worst on the continent in terms of allocating that budget only to employment costs. This is what Chinamasa was saying, the areas that he's targeting. You can see the youth officers at what level, women's affairs, all those other aspects. He highlights where he knows exactly where the clandestine employment has been taking place. So you can look then at the vote allocations from a developmental point of view. I just did this just to show you. I mean, if we look at socioeconomic rights, what is life, isn't education is important, the healthcare is important, and all those things. If you look at how we commit ourselves in terms of budget allocations, you find that we are not even moving. We are at 8% of the budget. And then the Abuja declaration says we must be allocating 15% of the budget towards healthcare. If you look at education, that's where basically we are meeting the Dakar declaration of at least 20%. But alas, 98.4% of that budget is going towards the employment costs. 98.4 is salaries. If you look at agriculture, which is critical with El Nino and so forth, the budget says that we need to mitigate against the impacts of El Nino. But you look at the allocation, it's actually going down from 8.3% in 2014 allocation to agriculture. It has gone down to 3.6% in 2016. Maputo declaration says 10% of your budget has to go towards agriculture. So those are some of the examples. Another example, if you want to look at transformation, just looking at Zimasset, this is also from the budget, where the minister is saying, if you look at what he had planned to spend on each of the clusters, the 4 clusters of Zimasset, food security and nutrition, we agree this is important. He had allocated almost 78 million, but the outturn towards the end of the year was just 28 million. So there's no money now, isn't it? He has indicated now that they are very mending the expenditures. They are moving them, I mean, from some of these areas because salaries are not being met, isn't it? They are struggling to even meet salaries. Social services, you can see there, 125 million were budgeted, only 44 million was actually the outturn. Infrastructure, which is critical, and utilities, water, electricity, sanitation, 128 million was allocated, but by the end of the year last year, only 20 million had actually been used. Cross-cutting issues. So you can see, basically, let me move quickly. You look at the allocation in financial intermediation, money that were actually, there's been an increase in bank deposits, but those bank deposits are not being leveraged for development. They are going for consumption, individuals. You talk to any bank, they're targeting civil servants, isn't it? You go to and garnish their salaries and so forth. So it's not developmental either. It's not going to the real economy. Now let's go back to our template, where we're talking about, I'm finishing now, yeah. Where we're talking about the need to shift resources, the structural bonus, isn't it? For low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. You can look at what has happened in terms of capacity utilization in industry. It has now gone down. It had recovered, but it has now gone down, implying that we have persistently deindustrialized as a country. So in essence, we are moving in the wrong direction, isn't it? If we are moving forward, we should be industrializing. We should actually be increasing the share of the manufacturing sector. According to the latest labor force survey of 2014, 94.5% of currently employed people are actually informally employed. So that's the source of employment now. And if you look at youth, some of you that are young, 98% of the currently employed youth aged 15 to 24, and 96%, if you want to relax that definition of youth, to 15 to 34, are holding down informal jobs. So if you are young within that group, your chances of getting a formal job are almost none, isn't it? That's what it means in today's economy. So I'm almost done. I did this just to show you it's another way of looking at the enclave economy, but looking at the labor force framework. So you look at our population, which is about 13.5 million. You look at the labor force, the economically active, which is about 7 million. Those are not economically active, they are dependent, isn't it? Students, homemakers, retired, sick, too old, and others. So we are looking at these. That's the productive element on the right, the economically active. The unemployed, it's about 11.3% using the definition that they use. If you are employed for 1 hour, during a reference period, you sell tomatoes on the roads for 1 hour, you sell juice cards for 1 hour. During the reference period of 1 week, you are considered to be employed. That's the definition. So in essence, if you look at this now on the right, if you focus on that, the majority of your people that are employed are actually communal and resettlement workers. They are vulnerable, isn't it? They're actually susceptible to El Nino. You can't build your economy on that. On the right side, that's where you've got other employed, including formal. If you then use, we say only 5%, isn't, of your workers are actually formal, isn't it? We use that to as something that is identical to decent employment. So if you calculate 5% of 2.5 million, you get 142,000. What it means is that it's only 142,000 people in Zimbabwe out of 13.5 million that are actually gainfully employed. So in essence, it's just a small segment that is looking after the population. Is that sustainable? That's the essence of this distorted economy that we are speaking about. So in essence, therefore, let me very quickly look at this is what has happened to the manufacturing sector. From 1960 to where we are now. It peaked in the 90s. Now we are even below the 60s, the Rhodesian levels, isn't it? In terms of the share of the manufacturing sector in GDP and also in employment. This is from the World Bank. You look at GDP per capita from 1960. We are way below the Rhodesian levels, isn't it? So it's an indictment to our independence, isn't it? If our per capita income is way, way below what it was, this is from the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Report. You can see we're basically at par with Sub-Saharan Africa, but we see Zimbabwe decided to go it alone, isn't it? And we're very stubborn about it, isn't it? They can go in the hand, Zimbabwe. Much about it, and that's what it has meant. This is what it has meant to us as Zimbabweans, right? You look at poverty levels. These are the latest figures from Zimstat on poverty. You can see that in Zimbabwe, we are atypical. 72% of our people are languishing below the poverty line. And it is actually even worsened. Re-engagement, you can see I've already highlighted it. If you look at the agenda that is informing now re-engagement, it's not a developmental agenda, isn't it? It's just about clearing areas, isn't it? Not even the deaths. It's just clearing areas first to the 3 IFIs, isn't it? The World Bank, the IMF, and the Africa Development Bank, where we've committed ourselves at Lima to clear the 1.8 billion by April, end of April. Now, if we are failing to pay salaries, I mean, everyone is asking, even the World Bank, Camille was asked, how is government going to pay? He said, it's very difficult to see where the money is going to come from, isn't it? When we are failing to pay salaries, government said we will borrow, but we know also the limits of borrowing. When people know that you are under El Nino, they know that you can't pay salaries, bonuses for last year, etc., you'll be actually insane to give money, to push good money after bed. So that's the essence of what is happening. In conclusion, I had actually included part of the framework, the priorities now in terms of reindustrialization. The challenge about Zimbabwe is that we are failing even on basics, isn't it? We are doing a book now on developmental states. One aspect, characteristic of developmental states is that there is social cohesion. If you look at the ZANU-PF government currently, would you talk of a developmental agenda when people are spending their times on Twitter, moving around with the dictionaries, isn't it? Shout at each other. You can see that this guy is reading the dictionary, isn't it? Looking for a word that can be, isn't it? So in essence, it's not a developmental agenda. That's a challenge that we have. If you look at East Asia, there was a champion and everyone was mobilized, not just government, even the general community stakeholders were mobilized around the developmental agenda, isn't it? Look at, that's part of the embedded inclusiveness, isn't it? That informs developmental states. But here in Zimbabwe, you look at the state itself, we're not even talking about bringing labor, bringing business. The state on its own, whether they've got a common sort of teleological sort of developmental perspective, I mean, it leaves a lot to be. So we're struggling on basics. Look at our institutions. Look at everything that isn't it? We are struggling on very basic things, dealing with the potholes, dealing with the sanitation, collecting rubbish bins. So we have got a huge challenge before us. So I like this very much from the World Bank, a schematic illustration of the linkages, how we can rebuild through linkages, starting with the raw materials, the resources, primary commodities. I think if you look at what ECA is writing now, Africa Development Bank, there's a lot of literature now around this. I've indicated it. Where you look at your mining sector, agriculture sector, you build now, you start reindustrializing. Forget about DMAF. We are trying to resuscitate companies that are struggling and closing, isn't it? They've got too much legacy issues. You can't sustain them. You can't turn them around, isn't it? Most of them have got high gearing ratios. They've overborrowed to the extent that you can't just pour in money into some of these struggling. Reindustrialization is the way forward. And a lot is happening already. There are some initiatives where I come from, Monde Valley, where there are programs that are even transitioning women in the communal areas from subsistence farming into commercial farming with telling results. They are being linked into value chains. are almost commodity by commodity. Yes, there are problems with contract farming and so some of the contract farms, but it's a useful beginning that can be leveraged. Look at all the dairy processors. They also have heifer programs, isn't it? Where they're trying to actually assist in terms of the farmer. So the issue is, going forward, we need to start where we are with the resources that we have, the mining, agriculture, and basically developing the value chains, productive capacities, etc., that are required. So I had actually highlighted some of these issues from the Africa Mining Vision, what can be done in terms of manufacturing. Ibo, you know where this is coming from? Jordan, poor Jordan, isn't he? He has done quite a very interesting work on how the mining sector can actually be a basis for creating linkages, even though it's capital intensive. There are fiscal linkages, basically highlighting the importance of revenue, maximizing revenues, spatial linkages, the infrastructure that is developed can be used for other activities, backward linkages in terms of inputs, sourcing inputs from local economy, knowledge linkages, the HRD and R&D can actually be used to spawn new clusters that are related. The forward linkages, value addition, government is trying to do something about it. In terms of Chrome, they've come up with a tax on exports, isn't it, to basically promote export. But these initiatives are very fragmented, they're splintered, and even government has not even spoken to the miners, isn't it? And in later seasons, fiscal periods, they've said, we can't do it, they are not ready. So we can actually suspend it for now. Why? Because our policies are not evidence-driven, are not evidence-based. So that's the challenge. Paul Jordan says, if the linkages cannot be made, the people's resources would be best left unexploited. So in essence, we should have left our diamonds in the ground. That's what he's saying. We would be better off, isn't it? I think we all agree that it. And he highlights that the best mineral that has got greater potential for leveraging linkages in the economy is iron. Iron ore is basically one that can actually assist us. So in essence, I'm done. Here I'm just talking about Paul Jordan. Thanks very much. I'm done.